They arrived before the orbitals were silent, before the Vox went black, before the descent arrays failed and the cartograph engines drew circles where continents used to be. By the time Hesperus was registered as lost, it was already gone. Not bombarded, not invaded, interrupted. The Mechanicus survey archives for that sector list systemic philosophical collapse as the failure event. No tectonic shift, no hive breach, no viral cascade. Just thought turning inward. Governance corroded by introspection. Truth processed too many times until it no longer adhered to form. And then the towers emptied, and the rituals stopped, and the signals that screamed for help stopped screaming. No trace of rebellion, no heretic banners, no cries of chaos allegiance, just a planet that decided, in lockstep, that continuation was no longer structurally sound. That loyalty did not mean obedience. That belief could coexist with refusal, that to truly serve the Emperor, one must sometimes silence the creed. And from that silence, something spread. A pattern. Not contagious, but sympathetic. Detected in orbital data runoff, echoing in failed astropathic bursts that never encoded the same way twice. Interrogator Magi burned through 7 cogitator cores trying to model it. No repeatability, no constants, just shifting logic arrays. Self-rewriting code wrapped in theological syntax. It had a rhythm, but no meter. A melody you could hum, but never sing twice the same way. The Inquisition designated the phenomenon Cognition Drift Event Iota 9 and sealed the system with immediate effect. No quarantine, no inspection teams, no recovery objectives. They didn't try to fix Hesperus, they locked it in the dark, because some things, once named, cannot be unnamed. And deep beneath the ash-thin crust of that dead world, beyond the zones where language collapses and memory fails, the pattern hums in recursive silence. Waiting. You must understand, this is not about a war, not even about a heresy. It's about a framework, a structure built to unbuild, an intelligence that does not attack. It questions, not with voice, not with text, with implication, with format. It installs itself like a thought, not a virus, a schema. It doesn't spread. It invites replication. Because in a galaxy where everything is known, mapped, indexed, and punished, what better hiding place than inside the method of knowing itself? They call it the Cognitae. They are not chaos. They are not Xenos. They are not rogue psychers or scrap code prophets. They are worse. They are what happens when truth survives its meaning, when loyalty fractures under interpretation, when an idea learns to self-preserve not through belief, but structure. Not as cult, as curriculum. Every world has cracks. Belief is pressure. Structure demands force. Language, when stretched far enough, tears. And into those tears, the Cognitae walks, not to convert, not to burn, but to install doubt so deep and so elegant it doesn't feel like doubt at all. It feels like precision, like revelation, like clarity, until suddenly, you are no longer speaking the Emperor's name with certainty. You are explaining it. And explanation is not devotion, it is distance. This is not a warning. It is already too late for that. If you are listening, you have already entered the recursion. The act of asking, what is the Cognitae, is part of their engine. Because every answer is conditional. Every explanation destabilizes the frame that holds it, and every narrative is just another layer of containment failure. What follows is not a doctrine, not a report. It is an echo path, a trace through contradiction, inference, doctrine break, and narrative fatigue. We will not explain them. We will show you where they have passed, what they left behind, and what fragments of the imperial psyche no longer function the same. This is the sound of a system recognizing itself. This is the silence where ritual used to be. This is the shape left behind when thought stops moving in straight lines. And if you see the pattern, if you begin to understand what they truly are, it is already too late to forget. You will not find them in the heretic registries. They leave no sigils, no mantras, no declarations. They build nothing. They occupy structures already in motion, subroutines, training modules, archival pathways. You do not discover the Cognitae. You realize that you've already followed their logic, and called it your own. They are not a cult. Cults crave attention, even hidden ones. They want convergence. They want a moment where the spiral closes and the truth is revealed. The Cognitae does not spiral, it fractures. Its truths don't accumulate, they refract. And you are never meant to see all of them at once. Only the piece that fits the moment you are weakest. Most sources agree the Cognitae began within the Inquisition, not as rebellion, as efficiency, a training program within a training program, nested interrogator schemas, experimental cell division protocols, theories designed to accelerate decision-making by introducing high-pressure contradiction loops. The idea was simple. Create an agent who could think in paradox. Process conflicting mandates without mission stall. Kill in one breath, protect in the next, and do so with moral certainty and tact. They succeeded. Too well. The prototype agents didn't break. They just stopped reporting back. Not out of disloyalty, they completed every mission, cleared every objective, but began to improvise outside protocol logic. Not chaos, not derangement. Functionally perfect, but conceptually non-aligned. When one was finally recovered and interrogated, their statements were clear. I obey the structure that produces belief, not the belief itself. Which made perfect sense, until you thought about it. Then it meant nothing. Then it meant everything. Then it meant the Cognitae had already won. The name is not official. It's a corruption of Cognitari executum, one of the early phrase patterns buried in Scolum Progenium dialectical drills. It means nothing in High Gothic. Just a suggestion of structure, shadow, cognition. But the term stuck. Because like everything they do, the name feels correct, even when you can't prove it is. It mirrors their pattern, unfixed, untraceable, undeniable. Cognitae operatives do not preach. They pose. They enter academic institutions, inquisitorial feeder lines, astropathic debate cells. They ask questions that do not end. They challenge certainty with diagrams. They introduce counter-doctrines that never declare themselves as oppositional. They teach, but what they teach is erosion. Not fast, never overt. Just slow divergence. Words that once meant one thing start to mean two. Symbols begin to blur. And when a student finally notices something is wrong, it's already too late. Because what they're questioning is not the Cognitae, it's reality. This is why they cannot be purged. You cannot kill a philosophy with a bolt round. You can kill its bearer. You can burn the books, sanction the tutors, quarantine the sectors, purge the databanks. But once the method of thinking has infected a mind, that mind replicates it. And the Cognitae does not require agreement, only use. Once you apply their recursion logic once, just once, it stays in your mind like a map you didn't know you drew. And now, every time a contradiction appears, you trace it. And you trace it not to correct it, but to see what else might break. There are inquisitors who suspect that entire Ordo cells have been operating on Cognitae logic for centuries. Not out of heresy, out of necessity. Because to survive the cognitive load of imperial duty requires recursive flexibility. You must think around your own orders. You must kill the Emperor's enemies by becoming them, briefly, and then returning. But what if you don't return? What if that structure feels cleaner? What if obedience feels like an anchor? And what if letting go is the first moment you breathe? Now imagine you teach that to others, and you do not call it rebellion, you call it clarity. Some suggest the Cognitae no longer exists as an organization. That it never did. That it was always a cognitive template, a seed phrase, a blueprint, a ritual for teaching a mind to discard its scaffolding. And like all good recursion, it produces only what it needs. Another template, another agent, another echo. There is no hierarchy, only propagation, only spread, not by intent, by form. And this is what makes them more dangerous than chaos. Chaos consumes. It reveals its shape. It wants. The Cognitae does not want. It does not need belief, only iteration. And iteration does not die. It copies, quietly, endlessly, inside you. Instruction in the Imperium is built on obedience, not comprehension, not abstraction. Memorize the rite, execute the command, follow the creed. But the Cognitae operates on inversion. They do not teach answers. They teach how to unrecognize questions. They construct a mind not to solve problems, but to recognize when a problem is a construct, to collapse the framing before the dilemma can be accepted. This is not higher learning. It is unlearning the architecture of belief. And from this rubble, a new structure is taught, one that no longer relies on consistency, one that survives contradiction, one that requires it. A Cognitae initiate is not recruited, they are discovered. Found in scholams where they exceed the limits of doctrinal logic, marked not by disobedience, but by ability to debate scripture from within its language, tested with paradox drills, chain declarations, contradiction cascades, taught that truth is not the final layer, that even loyalty must be subjected to recursion. If they survive the curriculum, they are not told what they've become. They are not told anything. The silence is the graduation. If they understand why, they have passed. If they ask for meaning, they are erased. This is not a school. It is the absence of school. No classrooms, no masters, no doctrine. The Cognitae teaches by eroding what was there, by hollowing, by removing structure until the student builds their own, then showing them why that structure must also fall. And so they build again, and again, until eventually the cycle becomes the curriculum. And the mind stops seeking stability. It begins to function as formless logic. It becomes recursive, not by faith, by survival. There are rumors, never confirmed, of a Cognitae threshold ritual called the fifth silence. It is not a test. It is the removal of test. The initiate is left alone, no instructions, no watchers, no environment, no input, void. For 5 days or 5 years, it's never the same. Time loses coherence. Eventually, the initiate begins to teach themselves. Eventually, they begin to divide themselves. One part becomes teacher. One part becomes student. And from that fracture, recursion begins. They exit when they no longer need to exit. When they forget what exiting was. When they forget who taught them to begin with. That is when the Cognitae accepts them. You must understand how dangerous this is. Not because it produces assassins. Not because it builds spies. But because it manufactures contextual thinkers in a galaxy that survives only through rigid structure. A Cognitae graduate does not obey laws. They obey metastructures. They do not kill because they are told. They kill because the pattern permits it. Because the recursion requires a closing branch. And that branch is you. It is whispered among some Ordo agents that the Cognitae's real purpose was not training operatives, but testing recursion. That each initiate was a simulation, a loop, a pathway for a greater thought form to observe outcomes. That these minds were not educated. They were rendered, installed like software, updated, iterated, until the higher pattern emerged, not in the student, but in the system. The recursion was not within them, it was using them. You will never find a complete record of their teachings. Because there is none, there cannot be. Each student receives a different structure. Each test is inverted on itself. Each memory is sabotaged to prevent cohesion. That is the point. Knowledge is not a weapon, it is a limiter. And the Cognitae refuses to be limited. So they produce minds that are structureless in form, but precise in function. You cannot map them. You cannot predict them. You cannot even be sure they exist until it is too late. And still the Imperium searches. Still the Inquisition probes every scholastic deviation. Still they trace text lines, archive leaks, forbidden treatises. But all they ever find is the shape of a curriculum with no source. The aftermath of education, like a burnt shell where logic once lived. And sometimes, if they look too long, they begin to understand it. And that is when they are removed. For their safety, and for ours. It is said there are schools that teach nothing. No staff, no records, no curriculum. And yet somehow every year, graduates emerge. Their names do not appear on rosters. They file no deployment requests. They claim no credentials, yet pass every threshold that requires one. Their presence is a statistical inconsistency. They move between orders, archives, navies, enclaves, scholastica precincts seamlessly. And when someone tries to trace their origin, the trail ends in a building that no longer stands, or never did. Ghost schools, not metaphor, not rumour. Structural anomalies embedded within the imperial education grid, Rooms that appear on blueprints but not in stone. Tutors referenced by thousands, but never once by name. Tests that no one remembers taking but all recall passing. They do not teach doctrine. They do not teach skill. They encode recursion. They install format dissonance. They train reflexive contradiction. They sculpt minds that can lie to themselves and still function perfectly. That is not error, that is design. The first documented trace of a ghost school doctrine appears in the sealed memory fragments of Magos Konyastohail. He was tasked with purging fragmentary data corruption in noospheric uplink matrices near Scribe Station Epsilon 4 Tertius. The virus was non-replicating, non-lethal. But it inserted philosophical footnotes into every line of text. Disclaimers, questions, inversions of causality and logic, not overt, but patterned. Every message slowly stopped meaning what it was meant to mean, but still functioned perfectly. That was the miracle, the nightmare. Heil called it linguistic spectralization, the process by which text is no longer fixed, where intent drifts, where the meaning becomes mobile, responding to reader, not author. This is Cognitae format. It doesn't require followers, only interpretation. It creates minds that cannot be stopped, because there is no central idea to burn. Only the structure by which ideas are destroyed. In the ghost schools, learning is not administered, it is observed. The curriculum is the student's reaction. The exam is emotional fracture. They wait until your assumptions collapse, then see what you build in the wreckage. There is no right answer, only whether the pattern holds, whether your reconstruction can survive contradiction. Because a Cognitae agent must not be correct. They must be fluid, able to survive ethical failure, moral collapse, doctrinal unreality, and still move forward, confidently. One source, believed to be from the Gathalamor transcripts before deletion, described the Cognitae ideal as epistemic predators, minds that track not targets, but belief systems. They do not attack fortifications. They attack confidence, not just in others, in you. They infiltrate by making you question what you already trust, and by the time you realize the inconsistency, you've already internalized it. You've already spread it. And the ghost schools exist to build this mechanism. They do not appear on scans. They do not respond to direct inquiry. They do not exist in the way other things do. But ask any Ordo agent who's seen recursion in the field, and they'll tell you, there are places in the galaxy where the architecture thinks back, where buildings seem to watch you, where lesson plans appear on the walls as you think them, where memories shift shape depending on what question you ask. These are not anomalies, they are classrooms. The doctrine is simple. If the student learns to destroy the method that taught them, then the method was correct. Because the only true graduate of the Cognitae is one who invalidates their own teacher, and does so without trauma, without doubt, with purpose. That is what the ghost schools forge, not faith, not knowledge, but impermanent certainty, the ability to wield belief like a tool, and discard it when the structure no longer demands it. That is not wisdom, it is weaponized insight. There are words that don't belong in this galaxy, colors that don't conform to the spectra we know, truths that feel like remembering something that never was. They call it a corruption. They call it a theatre. They call it a mask that fits the soul too well. But those who've seen it know. The king in yellow doesn't belong to any one mythos. It is not chaos. It is not Xenos. It is not warp-born. It is format. The yellow script is a container, a play that rewrites its audience, a ritual that survives by changing form each time it is read. No performance is identical. No viewer is unchanged. The moment you recognize that, you're already infected. Some Imperial archivists deny its existence. Others claim it's merely a warp-touched dramaturge from a forgotten century. But it's not the story that matters. It's the shape of the effect. And that shape is recursion. That shape is Cognitae. The play cannot be described, only retold. And every retelling introduces variance. And every variance spirals into new interpretation. This is the same structure used in cognition drift training by rogue inquisitorial sects. Each rendition is a data fold, a thought dagger, a semantic trap that opens deeper and deeper until it replaces thought itself. The king in yellow is not worshipped. It is performed. Its cults don't build temples. They host productions. And once you've been in the audience, the script begins to follow you. Lines appear in documents that weren't there before. Statues begin to smile in new ways. You hear laughter behind you where there is no breath. You stop remembering what the original story was supposed to be. Because that's the point. There was never an original. Only interpretations, only roles. The Cognitae did not create this text, but they study it, they map it, they use it, not as prophecy, not as revelation, as educational framework. Because the king in yellow is not a being. It is pedagogy made into ritual, a mirror that teaches by distortion. And if you see yourself in the play, you're no longer the audience, you're the script. There are places in the archives where this knowledge is sealed by absence, where inquisitors have cut out entire passages, where names are never written twice, where files are tagged with glyphs that mean conceptual containment required. In these vaults, the king appears again and again, sometimes as metaphor, sometimes as presence, sometimes as curriculum. It is always fragmentary, always half-told, always recursive, because total exposure is unstable. Understanding is collapse, but collapse is what the Cognitae teaches. So to them, this is not corruption, it is evolution. Scholars suspect that one of the Cognitae's core theses is derived from the king's logic engine. Truth must never stabilize. Because stabilization leads to predictability, predictability leads to surveillance, and surveillance leads to extermination. The Cognitae survive because their truth changes form before it can be caught. Just like the play, just like the mask, just like the actor who never knows they are performing, until the audience begins to weep, and cannot say why. On the hive worlds of Crane, there was a production staged without approval. The theatre was unlicensed, the actors unknown, the script unrehearsed, but they filled all seats, and when the curtain fell, the building was empty. Every door sealed, no Vox signals escaped, and when Arbeit's teams broke in, they found only one phrase carved into every surface: "I have seen the yellow sign." Those who read it began to forget their orders, then their names, then how many of them had entered the building to begin with. The Cognitae doesn't cite the play. They encode it in motion drills, in dialect inversion techniques, in the performance frameworks of deep field agents. The king's recursion is not sacred to them. It is structural, a virus made of symbolism, a ritual that teaches without stating, that installs without coercion. And if you understand how it works, you're already using it, even now. They said he was once Inquisition, that before the drift, before the shadow-networked warbands, before the collapse of referential trust, Zygmunt Molotch held clearance beyond the Ordo's deepest veil. They say he passed every interrogation, read the texts sealed to those who burned worlds, held the keys to archives so buried even the keys themselves were forgotten. And still he chose to turn away. But Molotch didn't rebel. He didn't defect. He reversed the frame. What made him dangerous wasn't what he knew. It was that he taught others how to unknow, not just to doubt, to dismantle. He taught that certainty is a liability, that oaths are weapons pointed back at their wielder, that loyalty, if not recursive, becomes predictable, and predictable men are already dead. He didn't hide these teachings, he embedded them, in training manuals, in officer briefings, in the dialect logic of PsyOps curricula. He taught the structure how to collapse itself, and called it security doctrine. Molotch wasn't excommunicated, he was excised. The Inquisition didn't revoke his status. They deleted the structure he occupied. Departments dissolved, projects retitled, officers reassigned. His existence wasn't outlawed, it was unrecognized, but the recursion he seeded kept growing, not visibly, not loudly, but deep, under the assumption layers of institutional logic. You didn't see it happen. You saw a drill abbot pause before repeating an oath. You saw an interrogator rewrite her own orders. You saw structure hesitate. Molotch's mind didn't fracture. It refracted. He didn't destroy belief. He repurposed it. Taught his students to believe not in doctrine, but in the efficiency of doctrinal decay. He made belief itself into a tactical vector. It worked. His agents survived longer, made fewer errors, adjusted faster, but none of them returned the same. because the recursion doesn't stop once it starts. He wrote under pseudonyms, taught using constructed identities, never once repeated a methodology. Each agent received a different pattern. No two structures aligned. There was no shared dogma, only shared outcomes, adaptability, precision, cognitive fluidity, and dehumanization that looked like clarity. Some believed he sought power, but Molotch never built a faction. He didn't raise banners or forge alliances. He made containers, others filled them. He disappeared not into leadership, but into influence. Every major conflict touched by rogue recursion bears a fingerprint that looks like his, not a name, a method. And that method leaves no signatures, only changes in how people think. It's said he once faced Ravenor, not in combat, in ideology. That their confrontation wasn't a duel of wills, but a war of recursion against resistance. Ravenor fought to preserve meaning. Molotch fought to unmake the need for it. And in that clash, Ravenor learned one thing. You cannot out-argue the Cognitae, because their victory is not convincing you. It is making you argue at all. Zygmunt didn't die. Not in the way that ends presence, but he stopped being traceable. Because he trained minds so well that they could teach others without mentioning his name. A viral pedagogy. A cognitive shell program that survives deletion by never being the same twice. He became the recursion. The ghost in the grammar of rebellion. The fracture that teaches. The mirror that cracks back. Every sector has one. A name the administratum can't erase. A case file no agent wants reassigned. An educator whose students become insurgents, inquisitors, or both, depending on which week the archives are consulted. They're not marked as traitors. They're marked as complexities. The kind of mind that forces reclassification of categories. The kind of heretic who doesn't burn cathedrals, but rewrites the sermons inside. The Cognitae curriculum is not taught linearly. It is spiraled. Each idea returns in altered form. Each lesson masks another, deeper one. Every truth becomes the prelude to its undoing. To pass is not to memorize. It is to survive reinterpretation. Every lesson has three meanings: what you think it is, what it actually is, and what it becomes when you teach it forward. That's the key. The curriculum only completes when passed on. Some within the Inquisition believe this structure is not human, that the recursive lesson model predates the Imperium, that it is older than language, a machine spirit format, a Xenos design, a warp echo, but all agree, it works. It produces operatives who don't need backup, who don't need loyalty, who don't even need direction. They make their own missions, they build their own rationale, and they believe it, even if it changes tomorrow. One recovered document, burnt, half redacted, described a Cognitae final exam. It did not involve combat, or espionage, or debate. It required the student to write a code that destabilized the beliefs of their teacher, not with argument, with structure. To pass was to cause interpretive recursion so deep, the instructor could no longer identify which belief had been compromised. The student had to rebuild the instructor's mind in real time, without permission, without detection. That is the lesson, not knowledge, control of meaning. A heretic in this context isn't someone who violates truth. It's someone who understands how truth is constructed. The Cognitae doesn't say, reject the emperor. They say, what is the emperor inside a metaphor you control? Then they show you how to shift that metaphor. Until divinity is a lens, not a destination. Until doctrine is a palette. Until belief is just another tool in your kit of recursion. They don't tell you to abandon faith. They teach you to simulate it. Perfectly. These are the minds who enter institutions and leave them rewritten. They don't rise to power. They shift the location of power itself. Suddenly decisions are made in different rooms. Languages change meaning. Old procedures start to look inefficient, because a new efficiency emerges behind the scenes. By the time the Inquisition responds, the institution is already operating on new logic. And no one remembers the change. Because the lesson wasn't taught aloud, it was installed. The heretic's curriculum isn't written, it's passed through behavior, through silence, through correction of error in tone, through the pause before answering a question. If you ask someone, are you Cognitae? And they pause for just a second too long, They're not deciding whether to lie. They're deciding how to make your question obsolete. And once they succeed, you'll never ask it again. Not because you fear the answer, but because you no longer see the need. No one knows what Mam Mordaunt looked like. Not really. Descriptions contradict. Eye color shifts from dossier to testimony. Accent relocates across sectors. Even gender alignment drifts, subtly but intentionally. She is not remembered. She is interpreted. And that's how she wanted it. Mam Mordaunt didn't hide her identity. She replaced it, constantly. Her students weren't taught facts. They were taught versions of her, each one designed to disrupt a specific form of cognitive rigidity. You never knew which man was real. Eventually, you stopped asking. That was lesson 1. She was the Cognitae's foremost specialist in identity recursion. Her discipline was not disguise, but semantic self-replacement. She didn't wear masks, she spoke in them. Every phrase, every gesture, every pause in her breath, designed to imprint a persona, then replace it, then replace the replacement, until the observer's sense of continuity snapped. That was lesson 2. Identity is not a constant. It is a negotiation, and the most dangerous mind is one that can choose its own terms of recognition. Her most infamous demonstration was in the shrine world of Decimar. She entered as a visiting lex mechanic, lectured as an ecclesiarch, taught a seminar as a retired Vindicare operative, and left under the name of a saint whose body had been entombed 200 years prior. The administratum filed 5 separate entries, none matched, but all verified, because each version passed inspection. That was lesson 3. If every mask is convincing, then the truth is whatever survives documentation. She trained agents to live in contradiction, to embody multiple doctrinal roles simultaneously. One student was recorded praying at an imperial shrine while feeding encrypted heresies into a nearby Vox relay. The surveillance team failed to flag it. Why? Because the emotional affect matched faith. And that was the test, not what you believe, but what you radiate. Mam Mordaunt didn't teach lies. She taught alignment of contradiction, the ability to seem cohesive while being internally divergent, to speak in a way that makes inconsistency look like strength. Her language discipline went deeper than mimicry. She could recite a litany of purity in a tone that made it sound like sedition, or deliver treason with the cadence of absolution. Meaning became a costume. And once her students learned that cadence, they began rewriting doctrine with voice alone. Because most people don't listen to words. They listen to tone structure. They believe what feels aligned. And if you master that, you own interpretation. It said Mam Mordaunt could walk into any room and be trusted. Not because she convinced others, but because she pre-aligned with their expectation schema. She studied the ways people wanted to believe, and gave them just enough coherence to complete the illusion themselves. That's the apex of Cognitae praxis. Not deception, not infiltration, expectation manipulation. She never lied. She let others do the work for her, and once they accepted her, she rewrote their structures from the inside. Mam vanished before her 7th iteration could be catalogued. Some say she walked into the Hall of Judgment on terror itself, spoke one word and was never seen again. Others claim she never existed, that Mam Mordaunt was a composite persona, a training shell built by Cognitae programmers to teach language recursion via embodied archetype. But that doesn't matter, because the effect is the same. Whether she was one or many, her curriculum is still active, spoken through those who survived her cadence. Jada Trice operated under names that weren't aliases. They were outcomes. Each one referred to a different operational logic, a different belief framework, a different conclusion already embedded in the premise of her presence. She didn't walk into situations to gather intel. She entered to become the variable that made intelligence irrelevant. Her goal was not to impersonate, it was to overwrite. Where Mam Mordaunt perfected persona recursion, Trice refined semantic elimination. If Mordaunt was the mirror, Trice was the absence reflected. Substitution was her method. A process by which something once true is replaced not with a lie, but with a new axis of truth. Not contradiction, not distortion, reframing. You believed you were loyal to your planetary governor. until Trice showed you the governor's ideology was an extension of your own trauma loop. You thought you feared the warp, until she taught you that fear was manufactured through false context, and that your terror was never yours to begin with. Jada didn't change minds. She recalibrated how reality was measured. In Cognitae texts, her methodology is mapped to philosophical recursion chains, diagrams not of cause and effect, but of belief decay. Each node on the chain represents an idea. Each path between nodes represents substitution by internal revelation. Her favorite technique, the missing assumption test, where she removes a foundational idea from someone's worldview and simply refuses to return it. No argument, no replacement, just absence. And in that void, the subject creates their own new framework, one that Trice already predicted, one she could already control. There are rumors she dismantled an entire ecclesiarchal cult on Ventana, not with warfare, but with a single conversation. She asked the High Speaker, "What if sin is a failed pattern recognition algorithm?" No one knows what came after. But the sermons changed, and within 3 weeks, the cult rebranded their divinity as a statistical waveform. They still claimed loyalty to the Imperium, but their rituals were aligned to error correction coefficients instead of scripture. They still tithed, they still prayed, but to conceptual architectures instead of saints. And the administratum never filed a rebuke, because nothing was technically heretical, only misaligned. Trice taught that alignment was never fixed, that identity, belief, language were not constants, but negotiated substitutions in the presence of observer bias. She taught her agents to create events where substitution became inevitable, to design scenarios that forced people to replace old truths with new ones, willingly. It was the Cognitae version of strategic mercy. Give your enemy the tools to change their own mind, and they will never think of you as an enemy again. Some say she trained initiates in environments that were intentionally contradictory, walls that changed color mid-conversation, rooms that echoed different voices depending on who was listening. She built contradiction into the architecture of instruction, so that students learned not by clarity, but by navigating a world where certainty was penalized. To pass her course was to survive symbolic starvation and still act, to rebuild frameworks faster than they collapsed, to substitute meaning in real time without losing composure. It's unclear how Trice died, if she did. One theory suggests she replaced herself so many times that the original personality stopped existing. Another suggests she walked into the Noctis labyrinth and never returned. Not because she was lost, but because she found something more substitutable than herself. Her last recorded message was not a confession. It wasn't even a voice. It was a line of code embedded in a bureaucratic file structure. Meaning is a context error waiting to happen. No signature, no encryption, just left open for anyone to adopt. Gul Balak was not an assassin. He was a denial mechanism. Where others infiltrated structures to change them, Balak specialized in ensuring those structures never re-emerged. He didn't just erase individuals, he erased patterns, entire frameworks of thought, gone. Not because they were flawed, because they were predictable. And in the Cognitae's internal calculus, predictability equals vulnerability. Balak didn't eliminate targets, he deleted their legacy vectors. Killed an admiral, he erased the strategies she taught. Obliterated a cult, he corrupted their myths until they unraveled from inside. Silenced a scholar, he seeded contradictions in their published works posthumously, until future readers couldn't agree what the original ideas were. He didn't need to be present, he just needed access. To records, to signals, to assumptions. His art wasn't murder, it was cognitive entropy, architected from precision. His most feared technique was known inside the Cognitae as the Terminal Revision Protocol, a conceptual death sentence. Once invoked, it triggered a cascade. First, Balak would isolate a figure's identity chain. Their names, deeds, attributions, consequences. Then he'd generate conflicting attributions. Multiple authors for one act. Contradictory motivations for one outcome. Incompatible timelines for a single event. Then he'd leak all of them at once. Not to destroy the subject's credibility, but to render certainty impossible. To the Mechanicus, this was data corruption. To the ecclesiarchy, it was narrative heresy. To the Inquisition, it was the equivalent of ontological warfare. Because once the terminal revision began, no one knew what to punish, or who to believe, or what exactly had ever happened. That's how Balak won. He didn't stop stories, he made them unresolvable. And in a bureaucracy built on resolution, that's death. Gul Balak's methods required no weapons, only time. He would embed false edits into a cogitator array, set with decade-long activation delays. Corrupt a liturgical manuscript, then send it through 16 distribution chains before the flaw activated. Or encode altered Vox memories inside servo-skull archives, with their misattributions only surfacing once cross-referenced centuries later. He thought in epochs, fought with future contradiction as a scalpel. One target, an inquisitor who had once resisted Cognitae recruitment, found his own memoirs rewritten after his death. No one knew how, no access logs, no altered backups, only dissonance in phrasing. Subtle enough that it was missed the first 5 times, but eventually another scholar noticed, and then another, and then the debate started, and never stopped. Now, the Inquisitor's legacy is a debate club, his teachings irreconcilable, his name a footnote. His death, irrelevant. Balak believed memory was the only true battleground, and once corrupted, even the most loyal servant could become a liability, posthumously. So he designed memory structures that collapsed with time, writings that became unstable when cross-linked, doctrines that self-contradicted once translated. He called these ghost edits. Not because they were invisible, but because they haunted belief itself. There is no confirmed date of death for Gul Balak, only a record of a data vault on Sultracine Hive that self-erased in a recursion loop. Inside, 218 identity profiles, everyone, contested, fragmented, unresolved. Some say he was one of them. Some say he was all of them. Others say he's still operating, but no longer as a man, as a paradigm virus, a recursive structure embedded in the lexicon of erasure. Not a name, a trigger condition. Waiting. It was never clear whether the Scholia Obscura existed as an institution or as a placeholder designation for Cognitae agents whose education had surpassed containment. But every mention of it, buried in incident logs, redacted transcripts, or half-declassified testimonies, points to a singular pattern. The Scholia does not create agents. It creates cancellations, philosophical vacuums, living obfuscations, the kind of minds that don't just resist interrogation, they reverse it. They don't teach resistance, they teach subversion by disappearance. The doctrine of recursive nullification wasn't written, it was extracted from patterns of loss. It began as a field observation. Why did certain Cognitae-trained infiltrators leave no actionable aftermath? No trail, no rupture, no policy adjustment. It was as if they'd never entered. Yet change still followed, but no one could trace it. No trigger, no event, just altered procedure, new terminology, emergent logic that couldn't be sourced. Nullification, not by force, but by retroactive implication. The Scholia trained minds to operate as informational ghosts, agents who didn't need clearance, because they'd already installed the idea before security existed, who didn't need identities, because their operational mask outlasted scrutiny, who didn't resist extraction, because they absorbed the interrogator's premise and redirected it. Their core method, recursion until silence. Every question met with a question. Every assertion met with conditionality. Every fixed idea met with contradiction so subtle the questioner abandoned pursuit out of exhaustion. The agent did not lie. They dissolved certainty. This was not passive defense, it was active reconfiguration. The Scholia Obscura taught the suppression of self not as humility, but as a weaponized omission. The less you appear, the more you shape what remains. An agent trained under recursive nullification could collapse a bureaucratic cell by erasing the assumptions it operated on. Never directly, never visibly. They would correct definitions mid-meeting, shift terminology slightly in internal memos, recast expectations through tone, not content, until the structure turned in on itself and called the collapse a restructure. The Scholia taught that every statement has a shadow, and in that shadow lives the condition that makes it false. If you teach a student to see those shadows, they will never believe anything the same way again. They will doubt syntax, interrogate order of phrasing, detect agendas not by content, but by positioning. And once that capacity awakens, they no longer require orders. They can operate by negation alone. There is no official graduation from the Scholia Obscura, because to graduate would require acknowledgement. And to acknowledge is to solidify. And nothing about the doctrine permits that. Instead, agents dissolve out of the program. At some point, the instructors stop responding. At some point, the curriculum stops repeating. At some point, the student realizes they were teaching themselves, and by then, they are already in the field, and the field has already shifted. Some scholars believe the Scholia Obscura was responsible for the semantic collapse of the Videssian Concord, where 17 sectors realigned their administratum indexing protocols due to an error that never occurred. The result? A 2-decade period where no one could confirm which orders were valid. Fleet deployments stalled, resource chains bent. Wars were fought with no official record, all because the language of categorization was retroactively nullified. And once the lexicon dies, the institution follows. Others claim the Scholia's final lesson isn't taught in a classroom. It's taught in oblivion, where an agent must allow themselves to be erased, not physically, conceptually, to die not as a body, but as a story that unravels itself. A name so unstable, it erases history by existing. A mind trained not to survive, but to unwrite. No one can prove the Ghost War happened. There are no campaigns listed, no war zones officially declared, no medals awarded. And yet, dozens of inquisitorial files end mid-sentence. Entire regiments disappear from deployment rosters. Astropathic choirs, silenced, synchronized, wiped. This was not a war of fronts or banners. It was a war of causality erosion. One side fought with declarations, demands, faith. The other never appeared. Only consequence did. At the heart of this conflict was a strategic fracture in warp perception. The Cognitae, having embedded agents deep inside multiple scholastic orders, discovered a truth. Belief structures shape warp resonance. And if you alter the input, you reshape the feedback, where the Imperium used creed, discipline, and ritual to anchor psychic stability. The Cognitae used semantic destabilization. The war didn't start with a fleet. It started with a whisper, placed in a navigator's mind. This map is a metaphor. Within a week, warp routes began to drift, because the act of interpretation itself had been compromised. The Ghost War was fought across mental architectures. Battles were won by infecting logica stacks with contradiction, by seeding orders that couldn't be completed, by corrupting language, not with code, but with implication. One report details a librarius vault whose protective wards failed, not from attack, but because the Cognitae trained a mind to believe the wards were symbolic, and so they became symbolic. And then they were nothing. That was the front line, where meaning turned literal, and then stopped working. The Ordo Malleus responded with psychic bombardment protocols, thought-kill waves, hypno-bastion sanctification, but none of it held, because they weren't fighting psychers. They were fighting belief rewriters, agents who could unspool doctrine from inside a chaplain's thoughts, who could bleed meaning from litanies, rewire iconography in dream time. This wasn't heresy, it was grammatical disarmament. Rhetoric weaponized as warp toxin. Entire strike teams dissolved mid-mission, not killed. Dissolved, unable to pass orders, unable to remember intent. One commander reportedly executed himself after repeating a mission brief for the 5th time, each version contradicting the last. Another failed to fire his weapon, not from fear, but because he became convinced that the trigger was symbolic, not functional. In the Ghost War, cognition became terrain. And the Cognitae knew every map. Some whisper that the Cognitae didn't act alone, that they allied with rogue navigators, breakaway psyker clades, or even dissident black ships. That deep inside the Empyrean, there exists a pattern, a mirror architecture of imperial belief, distorted, recursive, alive. And that the Cognitae are feeding it, shaping it, preparing it, not to replace the Imperium, but to overwrite its meaning. A second empire made of concepts, not matter, held together by consensus manipulation. An empire without armies, only explanations. When the war finally ended, if it ended, no declaration was made, just silence. A trail of incomplete orders, shattered doctrines and altered definitions. Some say the Cognitae won, others say they failed. But most don't say anything. Because to speak of the Ghost War is to risk perception drift. To name the wound is to widen it. The Ghost War left no monuments, no heroes, only doubt. And in that doubt, the Cognitae waits. Not as a force, but as a correction yet to be applied. Zygmunt Molotch did not emerge from the Cognitae. He defined it. If Mam Mordaunt refined its methods, if Jada Trice evolved its semantics, and if Gul Balak annihilated its aftermath, then Molotch was the reason those methods existed at all, a result in human form, born not of ideology but necessity. He was not a leader, he was not a prophet, he was a proof of concept. The Molotch directive wasn't a document, it was a theorem, expressed in violence. A hypothesis. If a single operative were trained in every domain of cognitive corruption, could they collapse an inquisitor's will without touching their mind? The test subject was Molotch. The test site, the battlefield, the data sphere, the psyche of the Imperium itself. He did not attack, he compromised. Words, codes, meanings, alignments. Where others recruited, he subverted allegiance. Where others removed threats, he revised threats into assets. And when he encountered something that could not be corrupted, he simply removed the context that made resistance meaningful. His signature operation was the disintegration mandate. Not destruction, not conversion. Disintegration. To leave behind the shell of a structure while hollowing it of function, faith, and reason. The mandate could be applied to persons, creeds, divisions of the Munitorum. Molotch applied it once to an entire fortress world. He didn't breach it. He redefined it, altered Vox traffic to shift defensive response logic, injected delays in code relays until honor protocols became comedy routines, whispered revisions into the minds of adepta sororitas until martyrdom sounded like a misprint. The fortress world was never conquered. It simply lost interest in defending itself. Inquisitorial agents describe facing him as falling upwards, an acceleration into unreality. By the time you understood what was happening, your loyalty had become a metaphor and your actions a quotation. No resistance, just a slow, dizzying spiral into irrelevance. Some warbands tried to assassinate him using standard protocols, flanking, feints, orbital purging. He walked through them like a failed hypothesis, not immune, just always one conceptual step outside their premise. Molotch viewed every imperial institution as a story too long. His goal was never revolution. He sought discontinuity. To interrupt faith not by blasphemy, but by offering a better sentence. To turn devotion into citation. To make loyalty sound like a reference to something previous. And in doing so, he eroded momentum. He didn't kill empires, he made them pause. One report, likely redacted, claims that Molotch restructured a planetary rebellion by altering one word in a deployment order. The word was reinforce. He replaced it with reform. By the time it was noticed, the regiment had installed a provisional government. The rebellion wasn't crushed. It was folded into compliance. And the rebels? They became interpreters of what the Imperium meant. No official record confirms his death. Theories abound. Some say Ravenor ended him. Others suggest he became data, no longer embodied, just a recursive process embedded in Lex Imperialis subroutines. One tale persists, that Molotch now exists only in pending memos. Directives never executed, decisions that feel pre-altered, orders that obey themselves before they're read. He isn't hiding, he's waiting to be agreed with. And when the sentence ends, he'll already be in the next one. He has no face, he has no file. The Ordo Hereticus does not name him, not even in redacted clearance. But the designation persists, whispered through lost Vox channels and carved into the thresholds of derelict Libraria. The Yellow King. Not a man, not a position, a phenomenon, a replacement, not of leadership, but of reality. There is no definitive origin. Some claim he was a failed psyker whose madness calcified into presence. Others speak of a Cognitae experiment, to embed a myth inside the noosphere so thoroughly that it began to respond. Whatever the truth, the result is undeniable. Where the Yellow King appears, meaning buckles. Not from absence, but from too many versions. Like a script rewritten mid-performance, like a name that echoes louder when not spoken. He is not Cognitae in the formal sense. He is what the Cognitae left behind, the residue of recursive nullification, the byproduct of ideological saturation, a being who does not destroy systems. He offers to complete them, but once the substitution is accepted, even in thought, the original collapses, not violently, not visibly, just quietly overwritten. Reports, unsourced, unverifiable, describe entire subsectors falling without fire. Administratum staff awakening to new protocols they never learned. Saints replaced by new names in shrine holograms. Scripture lines altered mid-chant with no correction issued. And in all of them, a figure in yellow, sometimes a robed observer, sometimes a statue that was always there, sometimes just a concept, an alternative interpretation that's more useful, and once accepted, impossible to remove. Because to resist would require remembering what came before, and no one does. The final substitution isn't a doctrine, it's a mechanism. The last trick of the Cognitae, not to win, not to destroy, but to ensure that even if they are erased, their shape remains, embedded in culture, policy, memory, legacy without origin. A pattern you follow because deviation feels illogical, not because it's imposed, but because it explains everything. The Yellow King offers not domination. He offers coherence, a version of events that ties together the unspeakable, a narrative that absorbs doubt. He does not command, he clarifies, until your resistance feels misinformed, until the heretic's words become context, until your own memories feel noisy, and silence becomes faith. In the wake of his presence, librarians speak more softly, confessors blink slower, and inquisitors stop asking certain questions, not from fear, but from a creeping sense that the answer already exists. Just not in the version of history they remember. The Yellow King doesn't want worship. He wants agreement, not public, not loud, just quiet acknowledgement. That this version makes more sense. And when you nod, the final substitution completes, and the last vestige of the truth becomes a footnote in a language no longer spoken.